Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has urged the world community to take note of rising religious hatred in India, and this is what he has urged the international community in connection with the 30th anniversary of the demolition of historic Babri Mosque. And this particular discrimination by Hindu zealots over there in India is not only being meted out to Muslim minority over there, but also to the other minorities, including the Christians and Sikh community in particular as well. And in 1984, through the Operation Blue Star, the Indian authorities attacked the Golden Temple, and in that particular attack, many innocent Sikhs lost their lives, and the religious sentiment was also disrespected by the Indian authorities. Owing to this, many people of the Sikh community started migrating to out of India to the rest of the world, including Canada, the UK, Italy, and other countries as well. Now, the Khalistan movement ever since has been gaining traction, and now it is gaining more force in the major capitals of the world. This campaign has been launched in the UK, in Italy, and a referendum for a sovereign separate state for the Sikhs of India was held in Toronto, Canada also. There was a strong reaction from the Indian side on this one as well, but particularly when we talk about Canadian authorities, they said it was held according to the law of the land. Now, this particular campaign has also been launched in Australia's city of Melbourne, and there are certain concerns which have been raised by the Indian authorities regarding this one as well. Now, there are certain reports by the international organizations and certain other countries also regarding the continuously deteriorating situation of the religious freedom in India, and the US Commission on International Religious Freedom says that, which I'll quote, that the situation in India is deteriorating. And at the same time, interestingly, the US State Department in its annual religious freedom designation listing hasn't included India in this particular list, over which there has been objection and a protest by the US Commission on International Religious Freedom. And it says there is no justification for the State Department failure to recognize India as egregious violator of religious freedom, as they each clearly meet the legal standards for designation as countries of specific concern. At the same time, the United Nations has also raised concerns regarding the deteriorating situation in India, and the Universal Periodic Review, in which 130 member states of this particular review made 339 recommendations highlighting some of the most urgent human rights concerns in India. And it goes on to say that India has undergone a serious regression in human rights under Hindu nationalist BJP government led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The government has escalated its crackdown on independent and democratic institutions and using draconian counter-terrorism and national security laws to prosecute and harass the human rights activists, journalists, students, government critics, as well as the peaceful protesters. Now, why the Sikh community wants a separate, sovereign state from India, and what does the international law say about it? What happens to be the role of international community in order to impress upon India to correct its attitude towards all the minorities, including the Sikhs? And to talk more about this, we are honored to have been joined in the studio by Mr. Javed Siddiq. He's a senior journalist. Mr. Siddiq, thank you very much for your time, for being on Views on News. Really appreciate that. And we are also honored to have been joined in the studio by Mr. Ramesh Singh Arora. He's former General Secretary, Pakistan Sikh Gurdwara Prabandhak Committee, and he's also the member of Provincial Assembly, Punjab, belongs to PML And Mr. Arora, thank you very much for your time, also for being on Views on News. Let me begin the discussion with you, Mr. Arora. This Khalistan movement and that struggle for a separate sovereign state for Sikh community is gaining traction. What sort of reasons do you associate with this demand of the Sikh community?
Thank you very much. First of all, what are the causes why the Sikh community is demanding their own homeland where they can spend their life according to the Sikh, we call it Trait Maryada, according Sikh code of conduct. And there's a long history, and that long history started way back when in 1947 two countries separated, like Pakistan and India. And at the time, the Indian government, particularly the Hindu government at that time, promised with the Sikh community that they would be having their own rights. And particularly when we talk about the Punjab, and it was categorically said that the Punjab would have its own significance, and laws for the Punjab would, and the human rights and all other rights would be given to the Sikh community according to the charter that was signed between the Sikh community and at that time Hindu establishment. But what happened when in 1960 the Sikh community realized that the Indian government is unable to give the rights to the Sikh community, and that struggle was going on. But when we come to the 1984, as you mentioned in your intro, you have shown the entire episode, what has happened with the particularly minorities living in India. And when we talk about the Sikh community, the Indian government at that time attacked on the Akal Takht Sahib at Golden Temple. And Akal Takht Sahib is the holiest place, and every Sikh wishes to go and see the Akal Takht Sahib once in his life. And the Indian government at that time attacked the Akal Takht Sahib, and they destroyed the entire building of Akal Takht Sahib. Not only this, at the time of assassination of Indira Gandhi, the brutality began, and there was a Sikh genocide. Unfortunately, the Indian government still, they don't call it Sikh genocide, they call it riots. And according to our the Sikh demand and whatever has happened, we call it that it was Sikh genocide, and they tried to finish the Sikh community, the Sikh religion, the Sikh nation from the entire India. And not only in Delhi, you can see in entire India, the Sikh community was targeted, and they tried to finish the Sikh community. And accordingly, at that time, majority, the Sikh community people, the prominent personalities, they went for the asylum. Some of them, they went to Germany, some of them went to UK, some of them went to US and Canada and Australia for the asylum purposes, because they wanted to live. Now, Sikh for Justice is demanding, and in 2018 it was began, and they are talked about that we want our own identity, we want our own homeland, because our Sikh community is not protected in India, and we are unable to get the justice. Sajjan Kumar, who was involved in Sikh genocide, unfortunately, the High Court of India is not giving, is not punishing him, because they don't have genocide law in the country. But on the other side, if you keep the books, and there is a Sikh fellow who is Arvinder Kumar, he is sentenced to the jail because he was having book under the sedition law, because he was having a book of Khalistan. So these are the black laws, draconian laws in Indian, you can say, in Indian country. So now Sikh for Justice started their struggle to have this referendum, and this entire Sikh community, either living in the Sikh diaspora, either living in UK or Australia or Germany, wherever in Europe, so they would come, they would vote. Prior to this referendum, you must have heard that Indian government started a propaganda that this will be a fair initiative.
Mr. Arora, beg your pardon for the interruption. I'll come to this very pertinent point that you just highlighted, the kind of propaganda the Indian authorities unleashed and try to, bring down this particular just and legitimate demand of right to self-determination. Mr. Siddiq, according to the principles of the UN Charter, and it has been enunciated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the subsequent International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, it is clearly enunciated the principle of right to self-determination. Despite all those provisions in these particular things, why do you think India remains stubborn in order to provide that to the people or the community that wants to exercise that right?
I think at the time of partition, the Indian leaders like Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi, they had promised that the minorities in India will be given their rights and civil rights, their right of freedom of expression, and all political rights which were enunciated and incorporated in the Indian Constitution. Unfortunately, as the time passed, the Indian government changed its mind and it did not carry out those promises, those commitments which were made to the minorities in India. Muslims, particularly the Kashmiri Muslims, they were denied the right of self-determination immediately after the creation of Pakistan. Although the first Prime Minister of India, Jawad Nehru, he addressed the Kashmiris in Lal Chowk, Srinagar, back in 48-49, that the Kashmiris would be given their right of self-determination, which was denied and is being denied till this day. Similarly, the Sikh community living in India, particularly in Punjab and elsewhere in India, they were also committed that they would be enjoying the freedom given under the Constitution, that they will have the right to elect their own representatives, and they were promised freedom of expression, freedom of movement, all this. But they went back on all these promises which they had made to the Muslims and the Sikh community. And subsequently, we saw the Christians were being victimized and they were being persecuted in India, and so are the Dalits. But the Sikhs particularly came, they became target of the Hindu mindset. And as we have already discussed that in 1984, the Operation Blue Star was brutally launched against the Sikh movement, which was started in Amritsar. And Sant Jarnail Singh Bhindranwala, the hero of that movement, was eliminated, was killed by the Indian forces. And that was the most bloody and brutal operation against the Sikh community. And that forced the Sikhs to flee India, to leave India, and to for safe havens elsewhere in the world. And they went to UK and Europe and Canada and US. And today, that movement, the Khalistan Movement, which was initiated by those Sikh leaders, is still going on very strong.
Mr. Siddiq, it has gained more traction, especially after the BJP led by Narendra Modi came into power back in 2014. And that is what exactly the UN periodic review also says, that it has undergone regression after the BJP has taken.
BJP believes in Hindutva philosophy, and they are saying that India is for Hindus. That means they are excluding all minorities, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, and others, from the Indian Constitution. And the 10 years or more than 10 years of BJP's government in India, we have seen brutalities being unleashed against all the minorities, Muslims, Sikhs, and Christians, and others. So the Hindutva philosophy has made life miserable for the communities, for the minorities in India, and that has been pointed out by international forums, United Nations, and you have mentioned the US report as well. So I think the Sikhs are justified if they are, they have raised this slogan of Sikh for justice or justice for Sikhs.
Right.
That is very important because the Sikhs feel that they are being discriminated against and that they are being persecuted. This farmers' movement that was crushed through the brutal force by the Indian government, and they have not carried out the promises which they had made to these Indian farmers. And I think this referendum which is going on, it has been held in Canada, in UK, and now preparations are being made in Australia for this referendum, justice for Sikhs, is quite justified.
It's quite justified. Mr. Arora, what sort of a message to the outer world, to the Western countries, the advanced countries, the developed countries, this series of referendums gave them? And what do you think has been the response so far wherever these campaigns have been launched and the referendum has been held?
Honestly speaking, when you are showing the intro, the message is there. Because as I talked earlier, that when this referendum was started, there was a negative propaganda from the Indian authorities, and they tried to stop this referendum. And there was so many demarches to, first of all, to the UK government. They don't allow them. But the UK government, I really salute them, and I extend my thanks to the UK government. They took stand and they said that no, this is basic human right, and United Nations allows them to have their self-determination law, allow them that you can go for the vote. And when there was a voting, there was 9 centers which were established to go for the referendum only in UK. And if we see, only in UK and Italy, more than 350,000 people voted. And if you talk about across Europe and UK, around 600,000 people voted for this referendum. Likewise, when they entered in Canada after this UK and Italy, so I would, how can I appreciate the Canadian government? They not only allowed, rather they took stand, and only in one day, more than 100,000 people voted, and they have to go for another day to vote. And now there's, as we discussed, now there's a referendum in Australia, and the Indian government again doing a negative propaganda where these people or the militants don't allow them. They are the one who left India, and now in your country just living and creating problem for the India. But I don't see people would support this idea and this initiative, because this is the self-determination law, and according to the UN Charter, it allows them. So you will see that people across the world, wherever the Sikh community lives, they would vote for it. And there is, as I said, we have struggled a lot, and certainly we have lost so many people. If we talk about 1992, there was a great movement when the Sikh students, not only students, and from the men, women were targeted, and there's humiliation. And the old people, they were targeted. The children, they were targeted. Not only in Delhi, they were targeted in Punjab, and they tried to finish this community from the Punjab. Now this BJP government, this is so anti-minorities, and they're trying to not only target the Sikh community, they're targeting right now the Christians, the Dalits, the Muslims. What has happened in Kashmir? If we talk about the Kashmir, what has happened in Kashmir? Kashmiri people were struggling for the Kashmir for last so many, more than 70 years. What is the outcome today? They have they just passed the black law, and now Kashmir is part of the India. So this is how they're dealing, and they just only want one community in India, and that is Hinduata. So when you talk that India is a secular state, but you are unable to give the rights, basic human rights to the minority groups, then I would request not only the human rights defenders, I would request to the United Nations. They should come forward and they would see how the human rights are violated in India, and they should be talking about. So not only the United Nations, the other community, the other countries, they should come forward and safeguard. They should give safeguard protection to the minorities living in
right. Ms. Arora, your point is well taken, and I'll talk to you. There is an announcement by the Sikhs for Justice that referendum they have called for on 29th of January in 2023. I'll be talking about this and the possibility of it happening over there in India. Well, I'll have to take a short break, and we'll resume the discussion from here. For that, stay tuned. Welcome back to Views on News. We are discussing the deteriorating situation of the human rights in the so-called largest democracy, India. And for discussion on this, we are joined in the studio by Mr. Ramesh Singh Arora and Mr. Javed Siddiq. On the phone line, we have another participant, Mr. Ahmer Bilal. Soofi is expert in international law and the former federal law minister. Mr. Soofi, thank you very much for your time, for being on Views on News. We really appreciate that. Now, this Khalistan movement, owing to the high-handedness and the rise of Hindutva ideology in India, it is gaining traction worldwide. Referendums have been held. This campaign is being launched, and the Sikh community says that it is in line with the principles set in the UN Charter and also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the subsequent relevant covenants. Specifically, they want to exercise the right to self-determination. What does international law specifically says about any community that feels threatened because of the high-handedness of the authorities to exercise the right to self-determination?
Well, thank you very much. Basically, the right of self-determination entitles any community to determine its own fate under international law and domestic law, which means if they feel there is act of repression against them, or for any reason their rights are not being guaranteed as promised, they do have the right to launch a political movement in order to assert their collective right of self-determination, which could take the shape of autonomy, more powers under the Constitution, or any other mode that those who are aspiring are seeking. Now, we clearly notice that the Sikh community in India is extremely disappointed with the promises made by the Union of India and its successive governments, particularly the present government, which has demonstrated serious high-handedness against not only Sikhs but other communities as well, particularly Muslims and Christians. The Sikh community has for now several decades been raising the issue of Khalistan and independent state for quite some time, and it has been their consistent practice over a period of several decades. There have been ups and downs in this movement, but it has been a demand which now recently, in the last 1 or 2 years, has taken traction, has become very vocal, has become very pronounced. And the reason seems to be that the Hindutva ideology, which is basically an ideology which says only one nation has the right to rule India, which are the Hindu nation, has clearly developed alienation for other communities. Sikhs in said momentum find a very clear legal basis to argue that they should be given independence, and this is something that they are presenting. Not only that, they are pushing this movement, they have also demonstrated by specific acts of various referendums abroad, which may be taken initially as symbolic, but truly they have become very powerful referendums in terms of expression, because the numbers participating has been staggering. And it has startled people because in lakhs, these referendums which have been taking place in Europe and in Canada have absolutely surprised everyone. So this is very clear expression, a political expression, a legal entitlement that they have. They only have to now look at the legal basis for the territory of the Union of India if there is a dispute that was initially objected to by the Sikh community at the time of partition. The Sikh legal community already is working.
Right. Mr. Soofi, your point is well taken. So regarding the United Nations or any of its major organs, does it have the mandate to implement that principle of right to self-determination if a certain community like Sikhs in this case, when they feel threatened?
Well, actually, there is not a very distinct forum for this. And we notice that in case of Kashmiris and Palestinians. But in the case of Sikhs, we clearly see that the level of voice that they have raised and the way they have pronounced their movement, and they have asserted and become their visibility in Europe, which is now the capital of European Union, and where all these states that have been sponsoring international conventions relating to human rights and self-determination, they are noticing all these developments. This is an extraordinary movement in true sense. So I believe it is voluntary, it is self-propelled, it is induced, and it is something that is becoming a voice, and it is developing such a strong traction that it cannot be ignored. The important capitals which eventually contribute to United Nations structure are individually noticing this. And I think that is the right way of what the Sikh community is doing.
So what I understand from this is there is no proper mechanism at the United Nations level in place in order to give a certain community or to exercise that particular authority over any country to make that country, to let a certain community to exercise its right to self-determination.
Well, that's my understanding, and that there is no absolute forum which gives a declaration of self-determination. That is something that the community or the group which is aspiring for self-determination has to struggle for, and it is the right way of struggling. They have adopted a correct strategy, in my view, because their visibility and their pressures is being felt in those capitals. That will translate into a policy towards India by these countries, where they will insist on India over a period of time, sometimes in the near future, that either you give the rights, either you satisfy them, or listen carefully to their demands. Because India is also feeling pressure otherwise as well. There are about 7 states, a huge country. It's a very, very diverse country with hundreds of languages, hundreds of different kinds of smaller nations and caste and creed. And its ability to retain itself, its geographical unity, is always a question mark. And it's just a matter of time, some analysts assess, that you will find that internal diversity becoming a basis for gradual division of India, considering the repressive policy. Had there been Congress in power, the possibility of weakening the Union of India would have been far less. But with the current policies, whereby they are suppressing, they are actually encouraging Hindus to go after minorities, that is sending an extremely bad message to all the minorities, and Sikhs are sensing it, and therefore we see a self-determination movement which is developing in a far aggressive fashion than one could imagine.
Right, Mr. Soofi. So what options, legal options at the international level are left with the Sikh community if there is no proper explicit mechanism defined by the United Nations for the brutalities and the discrimination which being committed by Indian authorities over the Sikh community? Can they knock the doors of International Criminal Court or International Court of Justice, for that matter?
They may not be able to right now go to International Court of Justice based on the preliminary facts that I am familiar with, but I think they have a lot of legal minds, young Sikh lawyers who are writing on this issue. And if you scan journal articles, you will notice that some writings have emerged which kind of develop a legal argument for a separate Sikh state, and also for creating or carving out their legal framework within the Union of India and the Constitution of India. So we have to see how do they gradually develop that momentum, and also whether the legal community at an international level also aligns itself to the nature of the arguments. But the most powerful argument is essentially the political argument, and that is this series of referendums that we have noticed, which has been conducted. A visible presence, a well asserted presence in Europe, in America, in North America, in Canada, US, etc. And I believe these are the countries where eventually decision making is being done, and the pressure is beginning to be felt by the Modi government already.
Right, your point is well taken. Mr. Ahmer Bilal Soofi, expert international law, former federal law minister, joining us on the phone line. We really appreciate your time. Mr. Arora, as before going on the break, you were saying that it is gaining traction, and these referendums back to back have happened in various countries across the globe now. There is a date that has been announced by the Sikhs for Justice Movement, and that is 29th of January 2023. So the kind of high-handedness Indian authorities are resorting to, do you think they would try to create more hurdles and would use more force in order to not let this happen?
Honestly speaking, I have my doubts, because if Indian authorities are creating problem and trying to hinder this process in Europe, in Canada, in America, how is it possible that they would allow the Sikhs to vote, and they would make ever possible initiative and step to stop, to hinder this process? But because the Sikh community is mobilized, and if you see the recent reports, you would observe that the not only the elderly people, the youth is very much mobilized, and now they talk about the Khalistan, that we want our own country. So let's see how it goes, but I have my doubt that the Indian authorities would allow them to vote, because now they are threatened, because the entire Sikh community is mobilized, so they would create ever possible step to hinder this process. So Sikh for Justice is struggling, and as Ahmer Bilal Soofi was talking, that this self-determination. So I have my doubts, but let's see what happens.
Mr. Siddiq, what's your take? Or do you think there is a possibility the Indian authorities are going to let this referendum happen in January?
They won't, because they are scared and they understand that their hands are soaked in the blood of Sikhs and other minorities. And the veil of secularism that Indian leadership was wearing has been torn out, and it is off their face now. They are completely exposed to the world. The so-called biggest democracy and the largest democracy that India called itself, and they tried to pose to the world that they are a secular country, and every minority in India, according to their constitution, will have the right of autonomy within the Indian constitution, which they denied. The right of speech they have denied, and the right of religious freedom has also been denied to the minorities. So the situation is very dire in India, and the world is watching very carefully. Although I am really disappointed with the report that the United States, has come out with.
There are two different dimensions to this particular issue. As far as the U.S. is concerned, I mean, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom impresses upon the U.S. State Department to include India in the list of the countries of concern,
which are basically violating the religious freedom.
So what does it depict? Is it lack of coordination, or did the State Department didn't actually look into that report which is given by the U.S. Commission?
To my mind is that India is now an ally of the United States, strategic ally, and to contain China, they are relying on India, and that's why I think they are condoning so many sins of Indian government and Indian.
But this particular commission is of a bipartisan body of the United States of America.
So they should have pointed out the maltreatment meted out to the minorities in India. And this is very, very pronounced and very clear that how the Indian minorities, religious minorities, are being mistreated within the Indian state. And I think the world is watching, and very many other forums of human rights, international human rights organizations, they have pointed out this fact that the Indian government, particularly the BJP government, is maltreating the Indian minorities, and they are not giving them their right of freedom of expression, and also their religious rights are being suppressed. And churches in India were dismantled, they were set on fire. Mosques are being destroyed. Muslims are not being allowed to pray in their mosques. And similarly, Sikh community is also suffering at the hands of this government. So I think the world is watching, but the world needs to exert pressure on Modi government to basically respect the basic fundamental rights of the citizens. And the UN Charter also provides that the citizens of a state cannot be denied their fundamental civil rights. So I think the world has to put pressure and penalize the Indian government in some way so that it starts treating the minorities in a fair way.
So what could be the options? I'll talking to you on that one as well. Now, Mr. Arora, regarding this US State Department's approach towards this issue in India and the kind of report which I would like to quote over here by the US Commission on International Religious Freedom that says that the Indian government's policies negatively affect Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Dalits. Well, the body clearly recommends that the American administration should designate India as a country of a particular concern and impose sanctions on individuals and entities responsible for religious persecution. Yet we see the US State Department, when announcing the list of the countries of particular concern, did include the name of India. What does that depict?
So this is the reality, because India claims that India is a secular state, but in reality, if we, as we were discussing for the last couple of minutes, that India is unable to give basic human rights. Not only this report, what Amnesty International is saying. Amnesty International report is saying that they strongly urge all member states to engage in meaningful discussion with India, including by following up on their past recommendation and offering concrete recommendation to improve respect for human rights in the country. So it means India is unable to give basic human rights to the minorities. We were discussing about the minorities protection in India. So how India will give protection a minority, because they don't consider Sikh community as a separate religion? What does Indian Constitution says? Indian Constitution Article 25 says that Hinduism is comprised of Jain Mat, Buddha Mat and Sikh Mat. So Indian Constitution is not considering Sikhism as a separate religion. So we are struggling for India, in India, Sikh community is struggling for their own identity. So that is a clear cut, what would you call? This is discrimination. So you're not giving a basic human right to a community which owns and concede and say that we are a separate religion. So Indian Constitution doesn't give it. Vice versa, normally whenever we talk, they say there's what is the comparison between India and Pakistan, but there's no comparison between India and Pakistan, because in Pakistan the Sikh community considers that yes, we are a minority in Pakistan, but we are the one who are privileged minority, because the Constitution says that every citizen of the state is equal, and yes, they proved it by opening Kartarpur corridor. We are very few people, and the total population, Sikh population is in Pakistan is not more than 25,000, but the respect we gain here in Pakistan is much more than normally. Sometimes I say that the Sikh community sometimes they enjoy more rights from the majority. So this is our consideration in Pakistan. If you see what happened in 2017-18, we passed the Sikh Marriage Act in the Punjab Assembly, which was unanimously passed. And not only the treasury benches, the opposition benches, they also supported. Pakistan became the first country across the world where we have Sikh Marriage Act. So this is how we consider and respect the minorities. So in India, if we talk about particularly the Sikh community doesn't have their own identity. So I would request not only the United Nations, I would request the entire world come forward and protect the minorities in India, because they are suffering a lot, not only Sikhs, the Dalits, the Muslims, the Christians. So India need to
Mr. Siddiq, as Mr. Arora has mentioned and highlighted very important points, the kind of treatment and the kind of respect the Sikh community gets over here in Pakistan as compared to the kind of discrimination and the humiliation, the kind of brutalities they have to face in India, that speaks volumes about the kind of human rights which are observed here in Pakistan. On the contrary, India claims to be the largest democracy, yet there is sheer violation over there.
I think India has made false claims of being the largest democracy. You know, the way they are treating the minorities, even their own citizens, the Hindu citizens, but particularly the minorities, Sikhs, Muslims, Dalits and others, Christians, they are being maltreated by the Indian government, and they are not being denied their religious rights, and they are not being given the right of self-determination or the right of expression, freedom of expression. And recently, they have done away with Article 370 in Jammu and Kashmir, which gave the special status to the Kashmiris, and now Kashmir has been made forcibly part of the Indian Union. And following that, the suppression and the oppression to which the Kashmiris are being subjected there is being condemned worldwide. Even the United States State Department, the European Union, other countries, they have taken note of the fact that how the Kashmir. And similarly, the Sikh community is suffering at the hands of this brutal Modi regime in India. And they are making it impossible for the minorities to live in accordance with their religious traditions, and they are being the life is being made very, very difficult for these minorities, and the international forums and the human rights organizations.
Right, Mr. Siddiq, but as you have already also mentioned that this particular situation that has been noted by the major world powers, including the US as well, but this recommendation, I want you to shed a bit light on this more, that when they recommend the US State Department to impose sanctions on individuals and entities responsible for religious persecution, so I mean no concrete action, they take the note, but no concrete action has been seen so far.
My own view is that Indians, the United States is basically condoning India because of their particular strategic interest attached to India. As I've said that India is now a strategic partner of the United States in the global game, strategic game, and that game is that to contain China in this region, they want the help of India. So that's why they are looking the other way. Otherwise, the entire world is watching, and they have shown their concern about what India is doing to its minorities and what the Indian record is and how the people are being persecuted there, arrested, tortured, and killed. And I think the world is not unaware of that. And the United States government is basically showing a different attitude towards India. And it is double speak. It is a double talk about as far as India is concerned when it comes to the United States.
Right, Mr. Arora, your last comment regarding the whole situation, the kind of role and the responsibility the international community needs to play at this point in history.
So my recommendation or my suggestion would towards the international community would be they need to see. Unfortunately, kindly bear me out if I use this strong word, India is becoming a don in this region. And when someone becomes the don, when he gets the support from the allies. So unfortunately, the international community, particularly the bigger countries, they must come forward and they play their role and safeguard not only the minorities living in India, rather they safeguard the smaller countries around the India, because they are suffering because of this attitude.
Right, I'll have to cut you short over here, and we'll have to end the program over here. Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Ramesh Singh Arora, former General Secretary, Pakistan Sikh Gurdwara Prabandhak Committee, member of Provincial Assembly, and Mr. Javed Siddiq, senior journalist. We really appreciate your time. Regarding these reports, in the line of these reports, India must correct its behavior towards the minorities or should let them exercise their UN-recognized right to self-determination, and the international community must ensure this particular exercise of right to self-determination. With that note, we come to the end of today's show. Until the next one, take good care of yourselves.